really appreciate the audience. I think a really important topic. I want to connect with how we've gotten here quickly. So it's a very fast movie. The materials I can make available. So I just want to motivate you to go back and look at it as opposed to explain all of it. Mm-hmm. I really want to connect it to what's topical in investing for semiconductors now, and it's clearly going to be a discussion of how that overlaps with AI. And as mostly an investment community here, I wanted to describe what's happening relevant to investment, both in startups, where I pay a lot of attention to, but also the CHIPS Act, which is changing the landscape. So I'm going to try to cover all of that in the time that we've got. This is extremely content dense, and I'm not going to apologize for that because the material really deserves it. So hopefully we can cover that in the time allotted. My background, I ran semiconductor fabs for many years. Ran the Semitech, which is a consortium of all the major semiconductor players. In my tenure there, we mostly developed the next generation of lithography, the infrastructure for it. It's called EUV. It's now in production. We do this about once every 10 to 15 years. It's really hard. It was really hard. And then I came out here to the Valley, and we created an accelerator program for nothing but chip startups. So I'll show you a little bit about that. We've had over 100 companies join us, and we try to make prototyping free. A hard thing to do.
Yeah, we are a little ahead of schedule, so from a time perspective.
We use the time wisely. I do need to say, because I'm associated with the CHIPS Act in terms of advising Secretary Raimondo, that everything I say here are my remarks, have nothing to do with the various levels of government. So this is what we're going to cover, how we got here, what I believe the most important things to be paying attention to as it affects semiconductors over the next decade or two, and then a little bit of a deep dive into the investment landscape, primarily around startups. And so, bottom line up front, there's no question that semiconductors are resurgent. Of the 20 top tech market caps, 16 of them are either semiconductor companies or they're significantly designing semiconductor content for their own needs. So the market has assessed semiconductors are relevant. I want to make the point repeatedly that we have never been more profoundly limited by hardware. And that's not hyperbole. It was no joke that Sam Altman was raising monies in trillions, reportedly, to do what? OpenAI is in the best position to understand the scaling laws of generative AI. And after 5 generations, they're able to extrapolate what it's going to take to get AGI. And it concluded, we need a lot more power plants, data centers, and silicon fabs to get there by brute force, or we can innovate and clip some of the brute force that's going to occur to get to AGI. But there's no question that AGI as a goal is going to have a dramatic impact. And we're also seeing, especially in semiconductors, both the forces for globalization and then now intensification regionally is occurring. That's having very significant impacts on a number of things that we'll talk about. I'm going to skip through the challenges for startups. You'll see them intimately. We're seeing a dramatic change in the landscape in investment. I'll try to describe that. And all of that combined still doesn't get us where we need to be. I'll try to describe what more needs to do. But how do we get here? The Vincent transistor was not that long ago. It was propagated through Silicon Valley venture capital. It scaled when we had general purpose memory called DRAM and general purpose logic called microprocessors. Became global for first Japan and Taiwanese for the foundry model, Korea for memory, and now China. In the 2000s, the industry consolidated for scale and concentration, and venture capital essentially left the sector. Then we had Moore's Law slowdown, beginnings of AI, and the emergence of China, leading to the chip shortage in the 2020s, the CHIPS Acts across the world. I'll show you those. And now the impact of generative AI, namely on NVIDIA. So to start with, Moore's Law is an expression that we can fit more transistors at an exponential rate on a piece of silicon. That dramatically lowers the cost per function of whatever we want to implement, which leads to more and more content in systems that are semiconductor related in a predictable manner. And that drives the industry revenue, of which about 20% is plowed back into R&D, which keeps the flywheel going because that R&D keeps Moore's Law going. It's a very quick snapshot of how we've gotten here. It was primarily government funding through the aerospace implementation, changing from vacuum tubes to solid state, which essentially occurred out here in Silicon Valley. With the invention of venture capital, in essence, in that period, we had Shockley coming out from Bell Labs, leading to Fairchild, leading to Intel, and then all of the spin-outs from Intel and others, creating essentially the Valley as we know it today. Fast forwarding to today, where we now have a global industry. The United States still has about 50% market share as measured by where the corporate headquarters are. But you can see Taiwan with the foundry content, Korea with the memory content. EU has declined significantly to about 5%. And within each of these regions, it's dominated by large companies. Startups contribute, but mostly through acquisition. The industry was vertically integrated from the beginning. There was some separate equipment and materials companies, but primarily the Bell Labs, the IBMs, the GEs were completely vertically integrated up through the system level. But for scale and for focus, the industry fragmented into the segments I've shown here, and that was quite successful economically. Not so easy, though, when you have to rethink the entire supply chain as you get beyond our current technology called CMOS. We need to restitch this back together, and the various CHIPS Acts are contemplating how best to do this with public-private partnerships. So a very successful fragmentation of the industry, which allowed us to scale, but with it challenges the innovation pipelines. Just to illustrate the concentration, we went through a decade or more of consolidation. Probably peaked several years ago. It's now politically very difficult to get approvals through the various regulatory bodies. I think the Qualcomm NXP one is the tipping point. The cost of chip design easily estimated to be $500 million per leading edge design. The equipment is owned in every segment by just 2 or 3 players, except for lithography, which is now one player, ASML. We had about 25 logic or foundry platforms. It's now down to TSMC, Samsung, and maybe Intel. And then in memory, both flash and DRAM is owned by 3 or 4 players. So the consolidation is essentially happened. The question is, where does it go? Similarly, with Moore's Law, it's expressed by various ways to look at it. First, the performance of a single core CPU, the density of DRAM, the density of processors. And then I think the most fundamental of all is the trade-off as we improve the transistor density, the power density, it takes to put power in and take heat out. This looks like the curve that bipolar went through in the 1980s as we lost our ability to cool bipolar. We switched to CMOS. CMOS is now right back on the exact same. And so we're profoundly limited by our ability to get power in and power out of these circuits. There is a solid roadmap, though, in all the key components for semiconductors over the next decade. We're now at the point where we have nanosheets. These are stacks of FET and FETs fabricated. They're called FinFETs, and there are roadmaps to take us below 1 nanometer for several generations of complementary FETs and atomic channel devices. Lithography, the next act is high-NA EUV, and the first prototypes are actually now delivered to Intel. The power distribution is going to be separated from the signal in the next generation, so that we'll have power from the back side of the chip, signals from the front. Today they're coupled together. That will buy us about 2 generations of scaling. And then when all that is limited, we're learning how to be able to put chips side by side or stack vertically to the point where the chips operate as if they were one monolith device. And again, that buys us probably 2 to 3 generations, and also allows us to put functionality where it most makes sense, combine those functions in a package integrated as if it was a single chip. And so there's a robust roadmap for that. To this audience, as a percentage of venture capital that went into semiconductors, we peaked around 2000. It's declined serially. And while it's flattened, and there's a lot of investment in AI as a percent of all the venture capital, it's nearly negligible. This is about $2 billion a year, $200 billion pie is about 1%. So depending on where you sit, this is either a non-issue or a super huge issue, because this is where the innovation ultimately comes from. So that's how we got here. I just wanted to set context and stage for a deeper dive. And so what do I think is the most important things to be paying attention to moving forward? So that's where we want to take it through. I'll do a very quick walkthrough of this. And the question is, how do these forces shape the industry structure both now and moving forward? And so the first idea is that every system company that matters now has a chip design house internal to themselves. Yes, they're going to drive the semiconductor industry, but custom electronics on their workflow, on their workloads, is become super important. And so, led by Apple, all the major companies now have robust chip design efforts. And on the other side, IBM has retreated. They no longer chip manufacture. The only one that's vertically integrated the other way is Samsung now through smartphones, for example. They make their own chips that go into their own systems. But they're an exception to the rule. So that is that trend is highly relevant to the competitive dynamics, especially for startups, because now not only do you have to have a superior solution compared to all other semiconductor companies, you also have to compete with the internal efforts of the system companies themselves. So that's very relevant to AI and custom accelerators. The next is we run a Moore's law that essentially doubled the performance or transistor density about every 2 years. That was the exponential. We rode that for 50 years. We continue to ride it to some degree. But about 2012, if you want to express compute as an exponential, we're on a Moore's law of about 4 months. Well, this showed the early days of that from 2012 to 2020. The generative transformer models continue on that vector of about doubling performance every 4 months. So that's incredible. That's really And that's now been going on for 12 years. The best expression of that I could spend the next hour on this, but the best expression came out of Bill Daly, NVIDIA CTO. Single chip performance of a GPU over a decade scaled by 1,000x. I would repeat that again because it's really hard to comprehend. A single GPU's performance improved by 1,000x over 10 years. And then we had another 1,000x because we figured out how to string thousands of GPUs at the system level to act almost as if it was a single chip. Now I'm exaggerating a bit, but there's 1,000,000x over a decade of compute performance through the GPUs. Moore's law accounted for 2x, maybe 3x. So our ability to scale a GPU from about 10 billion to 100 billion transistors over a decade resulted in 3x. So where did the 300x come from? And that was numerical representation of the math. Basically, we spent 5 decades going from 2-bit precision to 64-bit precision. We reversed full course and said statistical is just fine. And now we are operating at probably 8 to 4-bit precision for many of the models. The reverse course, and then the instruction set. So the numerical representation going to statistically based computation and the ability to do custom instructions within the GPU by the internet. And the point of it is that this is just an example of one algorithm on one architecture, the profound benefit one can get beyond just the idea that we can put more transistors in pieces of silicon. And generative AI and deep neural nets is just one algorithm that we're accelerating with hardware. We go to the national labs and in the university environment, and they could list 20 more algorithms that they would love to have custom accelerators on, because if we had it, training doesn't take 90 days, it takes 3 days, right? What could the algorithms do that are sitting in the wings do if we had the same resources applied at the hardware software optimization to do this? And so I would submit that we're just in the early innings of learning that this play is very, very economically important. Just this one. It's not the only one. And it's just not the only DNN or CNN that matters. I always like to go back to economics. And what's happened in plain sight is the CapEx of the 4 hyperscalers in the US. We're now running at a run rate quarterly that we were 3 years ago annually. And all 4 are roughly at 15 billion per company per quarter. And half of this is going right into NVIDIA's pockets. Right? That's the two are absolutely correlated. And so and we're in the early innings of this. And you can see that the economics, for the most part, are driving behaviors across the supply chain to fulfill this. And it's all NVIDIA. I didn't put last night's results, but NVIDIA's now is 26 billion, of which 23.5 is data center. That was 10x less 12 quarters ago. We've never seen product market fit play out this profoundly. Intel, not so. AMD, maybe. Broadcom and Marvell supplying Google and others as external semiconductor suppliers of some of their designs. And we also have chiplets, our ability to put function in different chips and integrate them at the package level. Those of you in the 1980s that were with IBM, we did 120 chips on a multi-chip module, so not particularly new, but to do this at scale and to do this across multiple companies. This is going to be a wave where we can then allow startups to do innovation on a chiplet, put that into a predefined template, and be able to do innovation much, much quicker, much, much more affordably. But there's lots of problems in order for us to scale the known good die out and make this a truly open marketplace. One of them is just the chip-to-chip interface definition is evolving. So what's really happening, if we step back, is the economics are driven by how much compute we can deliver, and where we were using just mostly Moore's law, transistor density scaling, and we now have 100 billion transistors. The roadmaps I showed you will get us to about 1 trillion transistors before we just don't know how to suck the heat out capably. So there's about 3 doublings left in CMOS. We're using this advanced packaging as another dimension where we've scaled optics at 2.5D, which means we put chiplets on substrate. We have 3D stacks already for high bandwidth memory. We've got stacks of 8, we're going to stacks of 16. The question is, can we get optics and all the other functions in heterogeneously integrated 3D? Those are bumps to come. And then this idea that we could have accelerators using accelerating specific algorithms, progression from FPGAs to accelerator ASICs to GPUs to the software stack associated with it is just one example of that new dimension. The next profound force, and this is a story in progress, is will Intel be successful in getting into the foundry business? I'm profoundly worried about their ability to compete quickly enough. They have to build fabs on spec, because if they don't, they can win the business but won't have the fabs to be able to deliver on the volume commitments, and hence the expansions in Arizona and Ohio, the launching of the foundry service, the attempt to acquire Tower Jazz, which was, again, we're done with M&A because it didn't get approved. And Intel, as they broke out, the foundry business is now losing $8 billion a quarter on it. That has negligible foundry revenue from external customers. The question is, can they make the transition fast enough to catch up to TSMC? Those of us that were in the industry, IBM and Intel were always neck and neck in the innovation space. Intel clearly scaled. They were having a 2.5-year lead for many years. And in a span of about 8 years, they went from a 2.5-year lead to about a 2-year deficit. Now they're trying to catch up.
Do you think they'll catch up?
Yeah. I don't think they will catch up in the ways that are meaningful to be caught up, which is high volume production in the foundry business at scale. I think that's going to be really arguable. What they will be successful in, I believe, is that they'll be able to get packaging as the wedge to win high volume customers. If they can win a couple high volume customers, they have a chance to make it. Truly have a diversified TSMC-like business. I think that's a dream.
If you go into this path of miniaturizing more and nano, like the nanometer stuff, and you're just reliant on the TSMC part. But if you look at LPUs or TPUs, specialized chips, which are produced in a higher, like they're like 40 to 20 nanometers, could be also produced elsewhere. Like, what about this path? Because like Rock shows it is possible to be much more power efficient and much faster, like 20x than the NVIDIA path. What is the take on that? I mean,
there's always room for custom accelerators for certain workloads. That will be part of the landscape. For Intel to be successful, they'll primarily have to, the wedge will be not having superior silicon, at best will be equivalent. The real race over the next decade is, can I integrate that at the packaging level in a way that is competitive? That's the wedge that they can use to win business.
He's right. We spoke with Beck Elsinger about this. He's 100% right on that. Yeah. If the packaging could be a lot more efficient, it actually, that really drives up scale, because it can take easily 2 weeks to just go through a simple packaging process. If they can reduce it by like 50-60%, the output just goes up exponentially.
Yeah. Who's working on that and who can invest?
There's a company actually we saw recently that is working on that. They're trying to create like an AI system to do the verification prior to packaging on the chips. So they're looking for errors, but it's still prototype.
Now, Intel certainly can lead us to what's after CMOS, which has to come. They certainly have the core capabilities to innovate and make that. But if we're talking about just straight up CMOS scaling, at best, you're hoping to be competitive and build all the infrastructure around foundry support, which is a very hard thing to do to get a third-party IP qualified on time at scale. I think you have to win the large line customers and focus your business there as opposed to out TSMC, the long tail.
I think that they also mentioned that they might be going into MEMS as well, just for some augmentation manufacturing.
Of course, yeah.
Is there
Surrounded by all of the I/O capabilities in the real world. There's a lot of gains to be had, again, at the system level, not at the component level.
Right, exactly.
is there a risk that this Ohio facility doesn't complete or doesn't scale? I ask because I live 5 miles from it.
What you do is
Used to.
you build it and they will come. And what I mean by that is either you win the business or somebody will buy your fabs and run it for you. So you have to fill these fabs. So once they begin construction, the shell's cheap. As soon as they start installing equipment, it doesn't matter whether it's Intel or someone buys the Intel asset.
Got it.
Keep your properties.
Okay, I can't neglect China in these discussions. It's very significant. There's been 3 waves of China investment. The first failed outright. The second wave, the success was in design partnerships, whereas China now has competent design in most areas. And then the third wave is the mid 2025. That's yet to play out, but it was certainly a serious attempt to go mainstream. I had done work with Bill Thompson at MIT to try to project where will China be in the next 5 and 10 years, and the answer is they will be competitive across the supply chain, with the exception of 2 or 3 areas. The design automation, which I think is going to be very, very hard to compete with Synopsys and Cadence, because it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. And in certain specialized equipment, mainly lithography. That's the only area where China will have a really hard time catching up, because this is just brute force. You just go at it, and unintended consequences are, if they can't buy from the non-Chinese suppliers, then they'll have to make it on their own. Otherwise, they probably would have never been able to have an indigenous supply chain, because all the worldwide supply chain was much more cost effective. And it'd be crazy to do it all yourself, but if you can't, you go build it. And so the last 4 years have been characterized by, I think, the supply chain view, and where we've put export restrictions and various other limitations in place. It's been a fairly broad brush attempt to prevent leading edge equipment, prevent leading edge support of foundries, and to restrict certain design capabilities within China. And so just laid it out here that it's been a fairly comprehensive attempt to keep China behind, primarily in the foundry business. In the memory business, they've essentially caught up, maybe even a little bit ahead in flash. DRAM, hard to say, but I wouldn't count them out. Leading edge logic's been really hard to go below 7 nanometers economically without lithography and without the design innovation.
Do you personally think it was a smart move to do this kind of anti-China kind of move to?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Let's hear.
Yeah. Okay.
It feels smart until we can't get any raw materials. Right?
Sure.
So that's the China card that hasn't played. But if they decided that it was truly economic warfare, if they were ever to invade Taiwan, that would be probably 2 decades before we ever recovered our ability to make leading edge electronics at scale. It's just how deep we are dependent on TSMC fabs. And if China were to react by restricting precious metal, it would probably 15 years before we even had close to an ability to replace that. So it feels smart until it may not. I don't know.
There's an article that they could shut them down, ASML, or could shut down some of China's stuff. Is that accurate?
That's true. You could not capture TSMC and operate it for many reasons. That's one of them.
Is that the counter to the resource card that China plays?
It is, but never discount the lack of quality advice that our leaders give in the political world.
Nicely touched on.
So this is like these are really hard questions. I really want to get across the fact that the restrictions are fairly comprehensive, are iteratively being tightened, that will never fully prevent all the things you're trying to prevent, and it will have lots of unintended consequences of which we haven't gotten yet.
Isn't it true the government's now putting billions of dollars into mining those precious metals and making joint ventures around the world?
I mean, you read coverage like I do, and I think we're just so far from ever being independent.
Yeah.
We're in a globally dependent world to the degree that we act as if it's not true. I think that's to our own demise. I want to get to the CHIPS Act. That was context for how we've gotten here, and what I think are important forces. The CHIPS Act, something that I've been working at for 7 years. I'm 2 years old, so go figure. It allocated $52 billion, appropriated it. 39, I'll spend briefly on this, went to manufacturing outcomes. I want to spend most of the time because it's relevant to the investment community and it's relevant to the startup community. It's the R&D provisions, of which there's 11 billion. And it's mostly translational issues. We have lots of good research. We don't have a lot of good ability to pull research into the point where industry will invest, especially when it's not CMOS. And so that's the primary grand challenge is to be able to take the innovation and get it to the point where industry says that it's invested in. And that's where our infrastructure has been missing for quite some time. There's also tax credits. There's also some that went from the DoD that stood up the regional prototyping capabilities. Just one slide on the investments. 27 has already been awarded. You can see the major recipients. There's still a long tail to come, but except for, like, I can think of one or two exceptions, the big awards have already been deployed. Now it's just the long tail. It's regionally, it's very distributed. The big ones, of course, is Samsung in Texas, TSMC finally in Arizona, Intel in Ohio, and Micron, perhaps 10 fabs and other than that. All huge investments. And so again, the numbers where we had about 30% in the US of manufacturing capacity, it's just to 12, it's going to go to about 8 or 9. These will probably recover to 12 or 13. So you're just maintaining your share. It may be increasing it slightly, but the scale of this is just profound. But so this doesn't domesticate your and create independence, but it at least allows there to be a viable conversation about, is there a relevant supply chain in the US, and we'll co-locate R&D manufacturing, and that has a lot of advantages to it.
How much more would you have to invest to get it to independence? And how big would the CHIPS Act?
About 500 billion.
500 billion.
Yeah, that would be perhaps independence in a decade. That's a type.
Thank you.
I see on the list there's a few for analog chips. Can you talk a little bit about those? And are those like next gen, like neuromorphic, or is it?
These are all manufacturing investments. So this will be analog devices and TI, microchip. So these are relatively analog manufacturing footprints are relatively $1 billion or $2 billion takes you everywhere. So it's unlike the next logic foundry, which got cost you 20 billion. If I put 3 or 4 billion into analog manufacturing, you've got as much as you ever want. So it's there. It's important. I would point more towards MEMS. There's a shout out for MEMS and photonics. silicon photonics are really capabilities that you want to own as well as package. Those are the ones that matter.
How much of a leverage is the CHIPS Act expected to drive private investments on top of it?
Just from what there's probably in manufacturing, there's probably a 10x. The average award is 10 to 15%. So, and in R&D, I'd estimate that the $12 billion over 5 years doubles the pre-competitive R&D run rate that we've had out there. So it seems like a small number, 12 billion in the scale of semiconductors, but pre-competitive R&D, if you added up DARPA, DOE, university investments, you're running at about a run rate of about 2 billion, and I think we're now adding 2 billion to it. So it's big for R&D.
I see Arizona is leading the way here state-wise with the amount of money invested. Which state do you think is the best in the country to build these factories and to allocate capital to? You always think of one state where
I think we're gonna have. I mean, Oregon's quite competitive. Arizona has been competitive. Texas, New York, Ohio, we a new footprint, and North Carolina, that region, but not particularly in more power semiconductors than CMOS.
does climate play a factor? Like maybe in Arizona that's clear and
Some in Arizona there's no water. That's most of the semiconductor manufacturing got to the point where you're geography neutral. I mean, electricity costs are different. But if you're putting it in Arizona, my gosh, that doesn't feel like that's a hard thing to do. So I think it's relatively geographic. The question is, where's enough of the critical supply chain already located? And we've got about 5 or 6 geographies that matter. And Ohio will be a brand new one, maybe Indiana, with the packaging announcements that are occurring there, and the universities. So let's go into the R&D side. As I said, about 2 billion run rate on the left-hand side, which is early readiness level. Our gaps in red is what's been, how do we scale up and test, is this technology ready for prime time? Then it goes into consortiums and then into the semiconductor industry roadmaps. And so we're trying to address these gaps. Just to plug on the Industrial Advisory Committee, we're selected as individuals and not as company representatives, and we've been trying to advise on implementing the CHIPS Act. And I'll just show you a couple outcomes of that. I was responsible for the R&D gaps working group. Deidre Hanford is now running the CHIPS Act. NSTC was running the public-private partnership working group, and Sujay Lu King, who up at Berkeley is the Dean of Engineering, she's running workforce. And we've been tasked with various sprints to weigh in on how should we invest the CHIPS Act money. And I just want to relate that specifically to the investment community and the startup world, because that's where it's going to have the biggest effect. The recommendations relative to what do we need to be doing with the CHIPS Act? Essentially building capabilities and going after grand challenges. And here it was about getting access to leading edge prototyping capability, building comparable, useful digital twin, building out the chiplet ecosystem, building out the EDA, the design automation tools that would support 3D packaging, and creating an ecosystem for startups. We described a lot of prototyping that's actually required, and you take a typical startup, and they're bouncing around between both wafer size and packaging capabilities. The life journey of a startup would be through 3 or 4 of these different prototyping. So it's a really hard thing to map and actually make available to reduce the cost of innovation for startups. The SIA, the Semiconductor Industry Association, called out for improving the access for innovation. The PCAS, Presidential Council of Advisors on Semiconductor, on Science and Technology, called out, noting the decline of venture capital, that we should establish a startup fund. And so did Eric Schmidt's group, SCSP, pointing out that we're not investing in the early stage. We should have a fund to do this, and it should have an incubation function because it's just not money. It's surrounding with all the support functions that are specific to semiconductors. The way-in for the investment fund is disappointingly that it should, disappointing in the sense that it really should be staged once we define the priorities for the NSTC, which is the public-private partnership. It's the modern version of Semitech for this generation to come. And it should primarily be doing early stage investing so we have more shots on goal, that we de-risk the technology so that venture capital will see that and then begin to invest. And the reasons is that I could spend the entire $500 million on one startup, and we've done that by 10 of them out there. So it can't just be one idea, one startup. It's got to be improving and de-risking the technologies. I'll just note that most of the regions have now passed a version of the CHIPS Act over the last 2 years. There's a really interesting Bloomberg analysis. The size of the square is the amount of money allocated, and the red is the amount actually appropriate, already funded. And you can see the various numbers. 30, they count 32, I count 29, up to 39 million deployed. But most of the regions have comparable CHIPS Acts, and the question is how to connect these two reasonable ways.
Are they fundamentally competitive with each other, or they all collaborate?
They're all trying to do comparable things for the region, and where they agree that it's just global. Most of it's not overlap. In the R&D space, we really strongly recommended that we don't rebuild IMEC in Europe. Right? IMEC does great things. Don't spend $10 billion. Don't spend all your money building duplicates. There's plenty of waste space to go after. Use IMEC for what IMEC does well.
So it's purposely collaborative.
Most of these players know each other. The companies that benefit all have always staged managed it so that if there is replication, it's because we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So some of it is duplicate, but it's duplicate because they're doing slightly different bets.
So no big nationalistic tendencies in each of these.
There's some of it, on the rounding, not in the main. That's because we can't afford all of it. So I'm going to get into the last section, then take your questions. I wanted to do a quick dive into where we are as startups. I used this curve to start out the conversation, which is my goal would be 5 to 10x this over the next 5 years. I think that would be appropriate for the innovation required to support things like AI. And so the life cycle of a startup, I don't need to go through this slide particularly, but I've noted a couple of things, which is the scale of the semiconductor startups are usually bigger than what we see in software and services. We're typically at Series A running rounds of 20 to 30 million. And it's not hard to see investment rounds at 100 million by B and C. It's really hard. There's very few players here. I showed it this way, just pay attention to the right-hand graph. If you multiply the percentage times the rise in venture capital, which is on the left side, it's about flat at about $1 billion. So less as a percentage, but venture capital has nearly 5x or more, but about $1 billion. So this should be 5 or 10 billion, not 1. And that's the problem statement. This is the type of investors in this space. This is a 10-year look. And so with most of the top 10, they're making 1 or 2 investments a year. 1 or 2 bets a year. That's the level. And then it quickly drops. In terms of corporate venture capital, same sort of level, but it drops even faster, maybe a bet every 2 years. And the usual suspects: Intel, Applied, Samsung, Tel.
Is there room for like a Y Combinator for semis, for the already exist?
There is one.
There's one, me. I'll show you. Again, I don't need to tell this audience this, but with the public markets drying up for growth stage investing in 2021, that quickly, the amount of IPO and exits dropped dramatically over the last 2 years, which has had, as there's less exits, there's less ability to raise dry powder, and that's beginning to play out. In terms of the decline in venture in the US, I think a lot of people say, well, not so bad because we had a bubble maybe, but we're back to where we were in 2018 to 2020. The problem is if you're a startup, that's not an interesting story because you get funded in 2021. And so, yeah, you're back to where you were, but then somebody's musical chairs happens and someone doesn't get a seat. And so this is absolute winter in startup land in hardware. In terms of AI, this is one view of the pitch book, but lots of unicorns got built up. But the point I wanted to make is that if you look at where the investments in AI are going, there's not much going into the hardware component of AI. That's kept us at flat rate. But if you look at venture in semiconductors and exclude AI, we're still very, very, very dry. So AI has helped. There's been a lot of bets. And I just showed wave one of those bets. It started in about 2015. These are all startups that are doing hardware innovation. They came in the form of classical von Neumann compute, but there was a lot of non-von Neumann to address the memory wall and in-memory compute, even optical compute and optical communication. So these are all gravestones appearing every day now because they got funded, and there's not corresponding reinvestment in that. And then wave two has started around generative AI and accelerators specifically tailored towards accelerating generative AI. They're not that different. They're all doing matrix multiply.
Yeah.
So they're not that different, but a lot of the early ideas were thinking about single chip performance. And now it's abundantly clear that even inferencing is a interconnect game of how much compute I can bring by connecting multiple compute chips together. And so the early ideas were all about scaling within the chip. And that's probably not going to be good enough. There's going to be a lot of inferencing on single chips, but there's going to be small accelerators in terms of chips you are already.
But I think you're talking about also the layering, right? Like when you're having an optimization.
Yeah.
Just quickly, like, what's your view on the non-von Neumann? Like, who's closest to being in production?
Nobody.
Whether it's edge or cloud, no one? Or how far away are we from non-von Neumann, like in mass production? Because I've looked at this space, but it was years away.
I don't see. I mean, there could be a niche application that somebody breaks through, but these are all very hard problems to solve in manufacturing variability around analog compute. That's what they all are. In a sense, is trying to tame the beast of variability in analog. It's a very hard problem. And I don't think anyone's really clearly demonstrated that they're solving it in such a way that it's going to scale for general purpose in any way. So I think there'll be some successes here, but there'll be a lot of gravestones. You understand the VC model, but why has it struggled for semiconductors? The obvious reasons. It's a rational response to a lot of well-funded semiconductor startups that in the 2010s never made it. They never got the product. Longer, it's less obvious in the early days whether you're actually got product market fit. And then you're always chasing a less good solution that benefits from Moore's Law. And so you have to be 10x, and then you've got to have the software stack on top of it. And so for really good reasons, it's been very hard to invest in the space. So the premise has been, if we can figure out ways to reduce the early upfront costs for prototyping, there's going to have better successes. And so that was the motivation for, this is a small commercial within this pitch, for Silicon Catalyst. In 2015, we got our start, and the idea was after interviewing entrepreneurs, there's lots of them. They basically said it's really expensive. I can't raise money, and if I do raise it, I just turn it over to the industry to build the parts. And so it wasn't really going to building out the team and innovation. It was basically turning it over to get verification that your ideas actually would work. And so the idea was, could you do something about that? And there was certainly signposts that said that services and software really benefited by having incubation functions. Y Combinator would be a great example of that, tailored around the services and software businesses. But what would that look like for hardware? Because the idea would be that if you could make prototyping free, that would make a difference. And when Synopsys and TSMC said, we'll give you for free for 2 years all our design capabilities. And TSMC said, we will build prototypes for free in any node. That was incentive enough to say that's a game changer. And so Silicon Catalyst was an attempt to bring the incubation into the semiconductor world. 10 years later, we've looked at 1,000 companies, we've admitted 100, so about 10% admission. They stay for 2 to 4 years. We surround them with all the things you would expect a semiconductor company would want. And so that's built from a focus around chip design for a fabless company, to expanding to MEMS and sensors, to now manufacturing technologies. We started in Silicon Valley. A third of the companies are anywhere in the world. 2/3 are US, 1/3 California. It's now in Israel, in the UK, we'll be announcing Europe. So incubators in various regions, although the capabilities are global. Surrounding them with all the things you expect from investors and advisors. And that's actually the biggest deal. It's the advice the companies you're getting. And then finally building the financial wherewithal, not just connecting to investors, but an angel group that's been investing for 4 years. And now, probably next week, we'll be announcing the first venture fund that will be investing exclusively in these companies. So this is the ecosystem that got built. We have now 60 industry companies that do what they do, either for free or heavily discounted. We've got the who's who of mostly Silicon Valley that give back throughout the life cycle of startups. So they actually engage directly with the startups. A lot of them are CTO level folks. Lots of investors have been paying attention, and we've been aligning with universities and accelerators. And this is an example of the companies that participate. Most of them do what they do for no cost. And it's, as you would expect, all the aspects of semiconductors, from design to intellectual property to fabrication to test. And the thing that is really hard, that is unsolved, is okay, if you want to use processor records, standard PDKs in a foundry, we can help you. You want to begin to change the process, you want to put in new materials in place, those are harder things. And so those are things that CHIPS Acts are trying to address, is as you move into degrees of difficulty of how much you want to change, you need more help. And there's a lots of aspects of semiconductors that are still very, very hard to go innovate as a startup. So I've completed my cycle here, and these are some references that I found really, really helpful. The two I would most pick out here is Chris Miller's recent book on just storytelling about what's happened to semiconductors since its beginnings. I think is really good read and gets you up to speed quickly. And then in venture capital, Sebastian's book is just interviewed just about every major player in venture capital, and has told the stories from perhaps a slightly different angle than you perhaps read historically. I think sympathetic to the importance of venture capital and where it fit in. I think we need to reinvent venture capital for this hard tech, deep tech world, and it's one of the things I'm currently working on now.
Is that mostly transfer to patient capital? The using that?
It's more than just minds and the patients. It's really helping the innovation process, because you need to access very expensive capabilities, and you're perturbing it. And people that own expensive capabilities hate it to be perturbed. And so that's the innovation dilemma in that space.
We're talking to DARPA, I just noticed, to create some events with them. We're in 2 dual use, 3 if I count your fund.
Yeah.
So this is a theme that's picking up in the family office world.
Yeah, there's certainly the seed corn for deep tech investing, but I think we've got to think of it more in a syndicated way. It can't be just individual efforts and hopefully the sum of the parts work. I think we have to think of it more as a very, very, system sake, describe it. So any of these books I highly recommend, but those 2 in particular, I think for this audience is the way to go. Again, all of this material I can make available and be glad to speak to anybody in depth for any of it. But that's a very quick fly through of a lot of material.
How large is your fund going to be?
It'll probably be announced between 10 and 15, but it will be annually refreshed. So yeah, maybe it's a 50 million micro fund, but progressively refreshed. But we want to invest all of it in year 1, so that year 2, I mean, at least dry powder. Yeah. And we're really looking to try to build a community of investors that care about this sort of thing. When we put some of Callis together, people always took the meetings. They wished us best of luck, tapped us on his head, and said good luck. And I think that's kind of where we are with deep tech investing, which is, good luck with that. Is it really gonna get returns? The point I'm trying to make is, it felt really contrarian to doing that, but if you get a first mover advantage, you get really good at it. I think by the time people wake up and say, we got a real imbalance of how we've been investing in innovation, and we're profoundly hardware limited, the money is going to flow there. You just have to point to NVIDIA to say, it is real. And if you can get in early and get it figured out and refine your model, get sophistication around your network, by the time people figure it out, I think that we'll look back and say, oh yeah, what was I thinking? That's very interesting. But right now, it's not obvious.
Would you say money, of course, is important, but would you say you need more experts, or you got that covered on the expertise side?
I mean,
what help?
Every time we get a startup that looks interesting, even the core group is just more of a feeling that the team is good, we like the plan of attack, but you need to bring in the world's best experts to give you an honest look. Is there really a gap here? What does the gap look like in 7 years? Not now, but in 7 years. And do they have an innovation that can scale? And you can never know that until you have done what
What size stakes are you taking?
These are small investments. So the angel group is at, in the hundreds of thousands, and the venture would be like a $500,000 check. Doesn't do the job, right? These startups need to be raising millions at seed, 10 million at post-seed.
Well,
Series A.
you're acting as a catalyst to your name. So.
It's signaling.
Right.
What we find is that if we've done the hard work of picking the very best, at least sends the signal that that one of the better vetting processes, and that's where we spend all of our time doing. Startup applies. We may have met them 5 to 10 times before they ever see light of day, and all of that is going through the fundamentals of what their plan of attack is.
So Dan, first of all, thank you for all the amazing work you guys have done at the CHIPS Act. As a matter of fact, we were working with some of the folks there, with like Caroline Sambuco and some of the other folks on the advisory board as well. We actually just did our first close been for quantum semiconductors and sensors for about 14, 15 million. For our first fund, at Formal Prime. So,
Can you maybe talk about what segments you're,
yeah.
can you throw that screen, maybe that slide back up? All the segments that have been categorized?
Yeah, so I can go into some, yeah, so, I mean, we mentioned.
It's like slide 20. Felt like 20.
Yeah, so I think what Dan brought up, which was outstanding, was that most of the space has been dominated by CVCs tremendously. And obviously you guys were pioneers with Silicon Talos and what you guys have done helping some of these companies move. One of the areas which we're very passionate about is MEMS, especially from the sensor space, as well as from the data acquisition space. We're obviously looking at AI chips, but I think you alluded to the fact that it is pretty congested space at the moment. I think there's some work to be done. The neuromorphic.
Yeah, I would just riff on that a little bit.
Yeah.
The real limitation is in the interconnect fabric.
Correct.
It's how do we string together? Are you going to out NVIDIA? Maybe if you have an accelerator like the TPU is, but where we're really limited is being able to power efficiently a network.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what you alluded to with AMD, right, where they have some issues with Broadcom, and obviously NVIDIA has just a tremendous advantage on CUDA, which basically takes the full stack, right, into account and reduces error rates and, you know, the power efficiency and the processing efficiency. This is something that they're light years ahead on and just trying to get through. So, but yeah, just going back to what our investment thesis, I mean, we are looking very, very diligently at a lot of the new architectures that are coming out. Obviously, MEMS we talked about chips. Obviously, we've been looking at quantum as well. So we have a few investments in the neutral atom space, but we're also looking at photonics and sensors as well. So some of the companies that you put up there, like for example, Oculite, we're huge fans of. We saw what they did, but I think to your point, right, there's still some work to be done on layering sensors or layering ASIC layers with.
Can you expand on the sensors part? What does that mean?
So for example, like we invested in a company in Europe called Faraday Sensors. What they're doing is most our oxygen, CO2, or hydrogen sensors are very expensive and they're very bulky, and they use a lot of power. So it makes it very inefficient for putting it into, like for example, AR, VR devices, or putting it into a healthcare device that requires a lot of motility, right? In this case, they've basically been able to a chip equivalent is the best way to describe it, by using an amalgamation of materials and certain fabrication methodologies, and they're able to reduce the amount of power used by like 50 times and have an equal or even better level of efficacy on detection of that element. So that's basically the idea.
Yeah, just to comment on the industrial advisory committee, I challenged the team to say, if we were to pick one thing to get really a lead in and sustain it, it's not obvious. And we chose silicon photonics.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly chip-to-chip communication, moving from the pluggables into co-package. It's going to happen in the switch fabric. Again, I guess we have a MEMS switch in Google only, but otherwise it's still expensive conversions from optical to electrical to optical to switching, and it's in sensing.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is the silicon photonics is right on the cusp of piggybacking off all the learning we've done on CMOS. There's a couple still supply chain limitations, but those are rapidly getting healed. So this is both in life sciences for sensing, in compute and networking. There's going to be a lot of big rollout.
So actually, I mean, as you know, George Whiteside's at Harvard, and you know was a big proponent for microprinting lithography very early on, and a lot of that work has now finally been translated into something that's tangible. So you know, I think that's starting to be commercialized. So it's exciting to see all the great work happening.
Silicon carbide or gallium nitride, I saw some of them mentioned there. Are they focuses of the CHIPS Act?
They're in scope.
Okay, they're in scope.
Gallium nitride, I think there are some limited applications, high frequency especially, Silicon carbide is, I mean, it's full game on for automotive.
And also for photonics too, right?
Less so.
Less so,
I don't see silicon carbide in photonics.
just more high energy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think silicon carbide is going to be a play of how quickly does China do what they did in solar.
Hmm.
I think that's because of electrification of the vehicles, they're going to be building up the supply chain very, very rapidly there.
What about the far R&D side of the world, like reverse engineering, things like that, that are just still in theory world?
Yeah. There's a lot of categories that might have some applications, and I wouldn't discount them. Reversible is one of them. I would just pay attention to anything that improves the power efficiency of the transistor. I think that is the biggest gap in the landscape right now. We don't have a good roadmap on it, and if anything can address that, it's the fundamental. When I showed the power escalation of the power density curve, we need something to address that. And the advanced packaging will buy us a decade, maybe.
Isn't that what you're sort of addressing?
I would argue that what we do is kind of the most advanced packaging, where we don't package multiple chips together with a model that we directly have. What that can do for system level power reduction is enormous.
There's just no escaping the physics.
Mhm.
Power in, power out, and we just don't have a roadmap to see much to get us to where we need to be.
Benchmark from saving down. It's good to slide towards again where you have different companies.
Probably.
I think this one, yeah,
Before.
the one before. It's very good. Up before that.
This one.
That one, yeah, that's.
Just want to know where else the opportunities are in sort of success stories.
Well, these aren't portfolio companies. You can check our website out for who we've invested in, our resources. These are all industry stakeholders that are doing what they do for the startups because they've been selected. We're trying to cost reduce the first 2 years, right? And some of these can run millions of dollars. And so it's a really big deal if you can take that to as close to zero as possible. So these are all existing, well, for the most part. There's a couple startups.
Can you talk about, just from your perspective, foreign investment? If there's, I mean, we've seen, for example, with the situation with Rain AI, where Aramco was removed from the cap table.
Close friends of mine.
Yeah. So just curious to know what you think about, foreign direct investment now that with the CHIPS Act and some of the restrictions coming in.
I think there's certain sensitive countries, but in general, we're so lacking in investors that it's hard to choose. I think it's just a sensitivity on individual countries.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll just note, maybe you just prompted me. 3 or 4 years ago, every interesting startup was able to raise money and have Chinese investors.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was what was sustaining a lot of these hardware investments. Because if you look through the cap table, and then suddenly that went to zero. And so there's been nothing to replace it. And so, the modern version of a hardware startup, when you take China out of the equation, you can speculate on what their purposes was and whether that was a danger or not. But the reality is that was a strong, reliable source of funding that just went to zero almost instantaneously, and nothing.
Usually the least money picked up in the slack is like, so a lot of Saudi dollars with venture, every venture capitalist now goes to the Middle East or Israel. You're not seeing influx there in this category, or no?
Well, the bottle is, and some of the families are in some of these fab deals.
Yes, and publicly, in most, in near public situations. The problem is not the availability of money, it's that for a very large investor, the amount of work to decide to invest in a seedling or seed stage company.
Stage specific.
Yeah,
Chinese are willing to invest as they have in gaming, very early with a lot of money. And they're
That's
not-
right. And that disappeared. And it's hard to replace that with these large sovereign wealth funds because they have so much money to deploy that they just can't get here.
Yeah.
You know, you're trying to make decisions on companies that are very early stage and they only want a couple $1 million. So it just takes a hard to deploy a lot of capital.
The other part is a lot of those funds, the Middle Eastern money, they've been trying to go direct rather than going through the funds, which you've probably seen. So,
Which isn't smart.
especially in this space, given the amount, I think I mentioned this to the group, that the amount of due diligence, which Dan just eloquently pointed out, that's required to make one of these investments, is not something that the average family office can simply do on its own, or, and do that in an educated way. So I think, for a lot of Middle Eastern family offices, they're like, well, why do we need venture funds? Because they've been accustomed to the typical fintech or, a health tech or enterprise SaaS or whatever it is. And they're like, well, I can do that investment on my own. Walid bin Talal did Twitter, so I can do anything else. But
Twitter did Facebook.
they did Facebook too, that's right.
But that's
So,
not novel to Middle Eastern families. That's actually
a general.
fund of funds.
Yes.
I was at one venture firm where an LP took a stake explicitly to get directs and they didn't get me, so they dropped out. That it is a mindset that I can lower my cost, but they forget that the only reason they got the deal in the first place was they hired experts to do the work to pick them. Last year we saw 8,000 pitches, we funded 3. I still got an argument with one of my LPs about whether or not you should have an SPV that pays me carry on the one deal out of the 3 that he decided to put money into.
That's right. So the question is now to his, what Dan just eloquently pointed out is the fact that there is all of these Chinese investors were on the cap table. In some cases, poses a national security risk because of the information that could be used to actually manufacture some of these technologies abroad. And that's,
Can't they block information?
Buying opportunities.
they have. Well, this is a past tense thing, so it's not a question of whether they could have. They didn't. So now the question is, okay, what do you do going forward? And now that they know that it's going to happen, they're like, well, we don't want to be part of an investment like that. So it's a question of, now that the CHIPS Act is there and where there is oversight and there is going to be probably, and you have a better view on this than I do, but more oversight on where money comes in. Rain AI was the first shot, right? That's never happened before where, at least from my knowledge, where you have a government saying, we're going to re-review an investment based on national security grounds and remove an investor from the cap table. So that's especially active, right? And it's an active deal, right? It's not like past tense. So,
So they force them to just give them the money back or tell them to
they
sell
had to migrate it to another fund. So what happened was there was another fund on the cap table. They had to move the asset over and then become an LP in that fund. So they forced them to be able to do that.
What's out the other fund?
Yeah, they did.
I think the point I would want to make in all of this discussion is it's one thing to do due diligence, but these are very early stage ideas. They hunt, but the game is yes, you need to make the decision, you need to fund it, but the journey they go through I've had some companies now 9 years. And I can think of only inflection points that have gone, their ability to engage with the supply chain, to meaningfully deal with customers and process the feedback appropriately and figure out where to get each head. Often it's a dual use. We often are using government funding or government accounts to be able to validate the technology where there's a different risk reward profile. The game is not investing as much as aligning a syndicate of help, because this is a long range thing. It's not, if you got the idea right, that's the call, you're good to go. That's always true in startups, but this is so much less. You can feel the friction, the traction, and you're on the exponential. And this question, can you execute against it? it's flat zero until it isn't.
And a
then
lot
you-
of money to get to the point where you've got a product market fit and got the first customer and take it out. It's like,
And then you need that design win, and I'm not gonna give you the design win because you look like a startup. And that feels like I can't risk my business on you. No, there's always to address this. It's not impossible. And like a sterile lab going IPO, making retimers to NVIDIA and it's worth $10 billion and, so it's doable, but you have to have a really good set of
the NVIDIA
advisors.
story, Jensen had to go to, my understanding, I have one person on his board, they were out of money and they weren't done. And he had to go to clients that had placed orders in advance and said, you need to pay for those now. I will never deliver this product because I'm out of cash.
And he ran silicon without verification. So he actually loaded the fabs without even knowing whether, he had to make the call. Yeah.
All the way back to, even though I'm not saying like Vinod when he was his son, flew, it's a great story. It's the one thing I really respect him for. I've got plenty of other issues, but he lost the deal to a bigger competitor. He was the better product. He flew out to the company in the Midwest somewhere, sat in the lobby and dialed everybody involved in the deal till he got something and said, why would we lose? This was better. And they said, sorry, you're a startup. Why don't you go away? And the story I heard from one of his co-founders was, we'll escrow the code. If we go out of business, you own everything we have that you need to give us. And they won the business, right? But they're like just so hard. So many, like everybody hears the great, wonderful stuff later. Who hears the story that NVIDIA was that close to bankruptcy? Like,
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, is we need to, I think, organize for success in a different way, because those are addressable financializations of the risk. But it's just one of them. The other ones are, and this is what I spend my time on, is does your supply chain scale? Like if innovation has been done because I went to the Marvell lab up in the Berkeley campus and you build working devices and you're running around with the hardware saying, but there's no path to drop that into Tower Jazz, well, that's a problem. And so we're always pushing the startups that you've got to innovate within the context of a scalable platform. And if you're not, then you're gonna not.
You don't have successful better master.
The best story I've got is IR Labs. IR Labs is doing in-package transceivers optically. I was running the fab where they built the first part. So it was at IBM East Fishkill. And I didn't know it at the time. We built a working photonics chip. Later on, I would meet the founders at MIT, and they said, yeah, we built a photonics transceiver in a foundry process. We did it with Micron. We linked it. We booted up Linux, all working. And I said, well, who built the logic RISC-V processor? He goes, oh, IBM did. I said, no, I ran that fab. He says, we don't have a photonics process. Yeah, we know. They hacked PDK and they built modulators, waveguides, all within process of record. Was it the best photonics process in the world? No. But if it worked, would it scale to millions? Instantly, yes. And so.
And it's lightweight.
Yeah.
Could you also comment on talent? I know this is a field.
Oh, Anita, do you mind, since you're newish?
Sorry, my apologies. I'm Anita Varvate. I'm with the family office, but also a fund called Earth Capital Advisors. Thank you for the invitation, appreciate it. Talent is a huge gap as well, because innovating that technology, but then also implementing at large scale, there's a massive shortage, particularly from the US standpoint. So Intel is getting the CHIPS Act grant from the government. They need 30,000 workers to build this out, and there's not that much talent. Even the factory level, low skill to high skill. How do you see that? Particularly, there's a US-China position, there's opportunities in the US as a result of that. How should one, even as a startup, when they're actually starting off, address the scale where you can scale right here, and also entirely new way of manufacturing? We don't need a centralized supply chain method, much more micro manufacturing environments that's happening in bioreactors and many other supply chain areas. So it looks like there's a new modality of also how we even manufacture things now, vis-a-vis what we used to do before. So how do you see that from your vantage point?
I'll start at the startup level. It's almost a non-issue. Our companies seem to be hiring over a long period of time, scaling to teams of 150. And they seem oversubscribed. They seem to be able to find great talent, not always in the US, so they're integrating design talent from elsewhere. But surprisingly, the startups seem to be able to robustly hire.
Probably more in the last 2 years. Because, well,
Yeah.
also you're in a category that doesn't have a lot of investments. By
Yeah.
nature, have more people, but
Go back
even
10
startups
years.
in general, ever since the sugar high ended, a lot of layoffs.
It's been easier, but even when things were highly competitive, no, there's exceptions. There are individuals that we're looking for that are hard to find, but in general, scaling from 1 to 150 has not been an issue. There's a bunch of good reasons for that. The issue we have is the issue you brought up, which is in order to scale up both the R&D and manufacturing, we need about 100,000 addition to probably a 300,000 base. In manufacturing, there's a technician gap that's well known, and I argue we don't have any gap at all. Anyone that started in semiconductors probably knew little about it. You learn on the job. So this idea that you have to have this unique semiconductor degree is, I think, overblown. It's nice to have it. But within a year or two, you can be very competent as long as you've got a technology background. And a lot of it is software skills. Not everything, advanced packaging, a lot of mechanical and thermal and things like that, mechanical. But I argue that if we could just make semiconductors sexy, there are hundreds of thousands that have decided they're going to work for these larger corporations on a mission that they may not feel as good about these days. And there actually is a groundswell of people saying, hey, maybe this is the place to be as a longer-term career. So I think it's a matter of creating the right retraining so that we have tech. We have a huge tech population that has just chosen to go into finance or social media or, you name the, and with very little retraining, I think they can be quite competent if they felt that semiconductors was the place.
So Intel has $100 million budget for Ohio universities as part of the retraining, upskilling, or that point.
Yeah, so it is a massive challenge. It's an aging workforce. So you're and that's again creating meaningful employment for people that normally were going to retire. I think we have to be innovative about that, but it's a solvable problem, and the monies are being significantly devoted that way. As in anything, if it's clear that there's a job, their pipelines get developed. So I'm optimistic. In fact, I would comment that a lot of the motivation around the CHIPS Act and thinking about what the gaps were, I still think are necessary to solve. But the biggest gap of all, which I missed, was, yeah, you can have all of that. But if the next generation has punted on being part of it, you don't have a chance. And if you can create the environment where this hardware is important and it's a meaningful place to be, and we actually are good at that, that sustains this entire thing. If you miss on that, no matter what facilities you construct, whatever tax incentives you create, you kind of miss the boat. So I think it's really important that get the Spike Lees of the world to make us sexy.
Do you have a best-in-class due diligence sort of call it checklist, or what you would be looking for if you were to hunt down a company, and how you what you think is most important to look for, both on a corporate and a regulatory standpoint?
We have.
In your eyes, what is the most important factor when you're looking at all these companies? What's the one thing that you look for that sticks out?
Execution.
Obviously, team execution, all that stuff. Forget about the typicals.
Team execution.
Putting that aside, that's obvious, and that goes to every single investor.
Co-founders won't kill each other.
Right. These are outside on a technical standpoint. what is the most crucial thing looking on a technical or regulatory standpoint?
It's not like, for us, it's not regulatory. It's, do you have at least a 10x on a pain point that matters? And will that be true 5 years from now? At least 10x on something that truly matters, that will be very hard to get to unless you do something different. That it's just not evolutionary. Almost everything else kind of, there's ways to compete against it that is very hard to, as a startup, to win. So what I look for personally is something that I look at and assess. I don't think we can get there any other way. Now, that doesn't mean that the 2030 intercept is a great thing. Maybe 2030 is 2035. You know, unfortunately, 5 years isn't that long in these cycles, but does it have to happen? That's the bet. And then when it happens is the variable. And when you look at differentiation, is that technology scalable? Is it a stunt, or does it have a clean path to being able to go into millions of units? That's the question I ask.
Where do you stand on patents versus trade secrets? Because now with the, with China, like maybe more entrepreneurs are not incentivized to publish patents. And like, do you care about patents? Is it something you want to see, or like?
Everyone says they care. We all inspect it. It's important. You should have it. You never win with patents. You win with getting first to market with a differentiation and getting sued because you're worth being sued. So you gotta have it, but you never win with patents, and you should have some know-how that isn't in the patent domain. So it's a combo. So the question is the innovation, how it expresses itself in know-how and patents. But you're going to get copied.
We've been generous with your time. We're very interested to follow up with you and Silicon Catalyst and our community. And so thank you, Calvin/Byron, for bringing us both these pillars. Thank you, Sanjeev, for everything you put together here. Thank you, everybody. We have one last thing, which is this family farm visit, which is about, and there's lunch at the Village Bakery, Woodside. It's all in the on the website and the WhatsApp chat. If you have questions, let me know. Some of us are Ubering together. And Ed Oates, you saw yesterday, he's a member of this club. So we're sort of going under his auspices and Mark Rosenberg. But we'll want to follow up on all these conversations that we catalyzed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.